After I'd fallen down the local history wormhole, I found myself wondering, why a shopping centre? Why did this place, once a priory, then a slum, become dominated by a temple of retail?
How did it come to this?
In 1865, Broadmarsh was one of the worst slums in the world, but the enclosure of Nottingham's common land was complete, so houses and factories could be built on the fields and the meadows to the north and south. And there were whispers in the corridors of power that maybe, just maybe, huge numbers of people shouldn't be living in slums. Chapter 1: War and Clearance. In the 1870s, local authorities got new powers. They could demolish slums, build council houses, and enforce building regulations. The first Nottingham slum to be cleared was an area of Broadmarsh called Darker's Court. Other early clearances included the Rookeries, replaced by King and Queen Street, and these slums north of Parliament Street, which were replaced by the Victoria train station, which was later replaced by the Victoria Shopping Centre, Broadmarsh's more popular sister. After a decade or so of enthusiastic slum clearing, the council slowed down and the clearances were paused altogether when the First World War began. Nottingham was bombed twice during World War I, in January and September 1916, with 3 fatalities in the second raid. A bomb fell through the house of Alfred and Rosanna Rogers in Newthorpe Street in the Meadows, killing them both. The third death was a young labourer living in Broadmarsh. An incendiary bomb fell through Harold Renshaw's roof, setting fire to his clothes and causing such severe burns that he later died in hospital. The First World War caused a shift in government attitudes towards the working classes. Many of the enlisted soldiers had come from industrial slums, and their poor health was noted by shocked army officials. So, after the war, Prime Minister Lloyd George promised habitations fit for heroes who have won the war, and introduced massive subsidies for council housing built to a decent standard. In the 30s, the last of the Broadmarsh slums were cleared, though the historic buildings of Drury Hill remained, and were popular with locals and tourists alike. The council had a few ideas about what to do with the cleared land, but then something got in the way. Nottingham was the first city to develop an air raid precautions network. The city's sandstone caves were converted into air raid shelters, including many in the Broadmarsh area. You can visit a replica underground air raid shelter as part of the City of Caves attraction. Nottingham was bombed 11 times during World War II. 178 people didn't survive the Nottingham Blitz, and 350 were injured. Nottingham got off lightly compared to many other British cities, and not many buildings were destroyed. After the war came years of austerity and rebuilding. Broadmarsh's former slum areas were wasteland for many years. In the 60s, the council and the city planners came up with an ambitious plan to transform Nottingham into a city of the future! And the Broadmarsh Shopping Centre was part of that plan. Why a shopping centre? And why did it have to look like this? Chapter 2: Retail Ascendant. In our age of contactless cards, cash machines and shops everywhere, it's quite difficult to imagine how it once was. Long ago, there was very little money in circulation, and very few shops. Most workers got what they could from common land, and only worked for money when they absolutely had to. Farmers and craftsmen bought and sold at markets on certain days of the week, and at fairs at certain times of the year. And whenever you were buying something, you'd spend ages haggling over the price. You might not pay for the item with money, but with work or some product of your own. Clothes were often the most expensive items you owned, because they were so difficult to make, requiring thread which took ages to spin, cloth which took ages to weave, and then it all had to be shaped and sewn together by a tailor. And because they were so expensive, you kept them until they wore out and absolutely had to be replaced. Retail, the practice of buying things from a producer to sell at a higher price, was very uncommon, and for a lot of products, illegal. And because there was so little actual money in circulation, the few shops there were often sold on credit. So a lot of a shopkeeper's time was spent calling at their customers' homes as a debt collector, many months after the original purchase had been made. In part 2, we learnt about enclosure, which turned common land into private land and turned commoners into wage labourers who had to sell their time for money and into customers who had to buy their food with money. As these people moved to towns and cities for work, the local markets and fairs couldn't cope with the demand. There were frequent food riots as prices increased, and entrepreneurs started setting up shops open on non-market days. It was in the 18th century when retail starts to become what we recognise today. The rate of enclosure peaked, and the Industrial Revolution got underway, making products cheaper and industrialists rich. The Royal Mint had to make more coins to cope with the new reliance on money. A few shopkeepers had a crazy idea during this time. James Lackington was one of them. When he discussed the idea with friends, he was ridiculed and laughed at. What a stupid idea he had! It would never work! Lackington opened one of the first fixed-price shops in Britain, a bookshop called the Temple of the Muses, and made a vast fortune from it. Everything was sold at the lowest price he was willing to accept, for ready money only, no haggling or credit allowed. Plate glass became a more common material in the 18th century. Shopkeepers installed huge windows to show off their goods to people walking past. And so, window shopping became a thing. The growth of shops accelerated, especially in London, where tourists got the idea that Britain was a nation of shopkeepers, a phrase supposedly used by Napoleon. In the latter half of the 19th century, the labour movement started securing better pay and shorter hours for workers, meaning more time and money to go shopping. To keep people buying, retailers and manufacturers pushed the idea that items should be replaced when they were outdated, rather than worn out. The growth of shops was interrupted by the World Wars, and the years of austerity and rationing that came after World War II. When Britain's economy had recovered by the early 60s and incomes were rising, the young, who had been born in the post-war baby boom and grown up with rationing and make do and mend, had had enough. They rebelled. I don't want to fix my t-shirt, Mum. Just buy a new one. They shopped more than any generation had shopped before. Britain's retail sector exploded, and the country's shopping habits were changed forever. Chapter 3. Concrete and Steel. The Industrial Revolution changed a lot about our society, including our architecture. In the late 19th century, architects experimented with concrete, and some had the clever idea of reinforcing it with iron or steel, which was now cheaper due to mass production. Radical architects of the early 20th century created daring new buildings with skeletons of steel and concrete muscles. These buildings were the beginning of modern architecture, and it's difficult to imagine how radical and exciting they once were. After both the First and Second World Wars, there was a move to reject traditions and certainties of the old world, the world that had allowed such catastrophes to occur, and a focus on creating a better world for the future. So modern architecture really took off, and more traditional architecture fell out of fashion. The style that became known as Brutalism began in France, with this building designed by this guy. It shocked the architectural world. The building was naked. No cladding covered its concrete. Its concrete muscles were exposed to air and eye. This was a building that was honest about its origins in cash-strapped times, was honest about what it was made of, and, like the humans who designed and built it, it was imperfect. The defects shout at one from all parts of the structure. We have no money. Exposed concrete shows incidents of the shuttering, the joints of the planks, the fibres and knots of the wood. In men and women, do you not see wrinkles and birthmarks? The building was an instant hit with architects, who made pilgrimages from across the world to see it for themselves and marvel at its rawness. Locals, on the other hand, thought it looked shit. Architects imported the style to Britain and gave it the name Brutalism, not because it brutalises landscapes, but from the French for raw concrete.
Béton brut.
Architects loved its rawness, and local authorities loved its cheapness. So, in Nottingham, as across the country, city planners fell in love with raw concrete and wanted to build lots of new futuristic concrete buildings. But here in Nottingham, with the city council ashamed of its recent history of having the worst slums in the country, there was an even greater desire to do away with the old and focus on the new. There was a slight problem, however. Nottingham hadn't been bombed as much as many other cities, so there was still a lot of old buildings around. These remnants of the old world, the world of war, the world of slums, stood in the way of progress. They would have to go to make room for the buildings of the future. Victoria train station, the Black Boy Hotel, and many more were all destroyed to make way for concrete. And, of course, the medieval Drury Hill had to go, to make room for the Broadmarsh shopping centre. I asked John Grindrod, author of Concretopia and How to Love Brutalism, about Broadmarsh. He said, "When Broadmarsh was planned and built, there was a move away from creating spectacular modernist buildings and instead towards structures that are almost attempting to become invisible. Massive as Broadmarsh is, there are few attempts to make an architectural statement here. Broadmarsh is shy brutalism, the final version of a style which had once been so playful, but by the early 70s was rather more sober. Architects had come to realise that the public preferred more traditional buildings, so concrete was covered in bricks to help the new buildings blend in. The post-war world was a strange mix of optimism and anxiety, and brutalism came to express this confusion, the hope of the space race and the fear of the nuclear bomb. The late brutalism of Broadmarsh is where the rising rocket meets the falling missile. In addition to representing Cold War fears, the falling missile in Broadmarsh's space-age frontage resembles an arrow, highlighting that modern Nottingham is the city of Robin Hood, but in the future! Chapter 4. The Protesters. You might think that redevelopments of this scale must have had popular support to go ahead. I went to the Nottinghamshire archives to read articles, letters and other documents relating to Nottingham's brutal redevelopments. And I discovered that the people of Nottingham were not happy with what was being done to the city.
We know that thousands of people are worried by the destruction which is taking place in this city, but the chief officials of this city, your servants, choose to ignore you. The local authority has betrayed our trust in them.
Our heritage, which we hold in trust for the future, is being whittled away without the citizens first having been invited to make their opinions known or felt.
Citizens have the impression that the local authority is determined to destroy Nottingham's character and has nearly succeeded.
The Nottingham Hidden History team was formed during the redevelopments, hoping to save the ancient caves that were being discovered and promptly destroyed as work got underway. There was a campaign by local residents to halt the concrete tide, to save the historic buildings and caves that was scheduled for annihilation. The best document I read in the archives was a profile of the leaders and coordinators of this Nottingham resistance, an article by Harry Martin titled The Protesters. Nottingham has a long history of rebellious heroes, from Robin Hood and his merry men, to Ned Ludd and the Luddites, to Miss Palmer and the Protesters.
The voice of legitimate protest in a city which is almost notorious for its contentiousness belongs not to the long-haired left-wing intellectuals fired with a burning zeal of youth to put the world to rights, but a genteel group of little old ladies, and it is their frail shoulders which bears the burden of the battle to preserve Nottingham's historic heritage.
They wrote letters to the council, to the planners, to the architects, to local newspapers, and encouraged others to do the same.
Drury Hill is at least 1,000 years old. An old street is more attractive to visitors than a modern enclosed shopping precinct.
The damage done to our city during the last war by enemy raiders pales into insignificance beside the wholesale and widespread demolition carried out by the corporation in pursuit of financial gain.
There was enough outcry that public inquiries were held into the redevelopments, where it transpired that permission to demolish Drury Hill had been given before any notices of the planning application had been posted, before any Nottingham residents could oppose it. An air of secrecy and corruption surrounded the Broadmarsh redevelopment, which made a lot of people disillusioned with the local authority.
Of all the redevelopment schemes in the city, there is only one for which practically no information is available to the general public. It is the Broadmarsh scheme, which includes what is probably the most historic part of the city.
The council has robbed the citizens of a favourite part of their city. The planning officer said that it was only a matter of sentiment that people wanted to keep Drury Hill. He does not live in Nottingham.
The councillors and the planners seemed confused by the opposition to the scheme. A shopping revolution was underway, and Nottingham must be a part of it. The city should not focus on the past with its slums and its hardships, but on the great consumerist future ahead.
I am aware that the name Broadmarsh in its various forms can be traced back over hundreds of years, but it is also true that not everything connected with this part of the city in the past 100 years has necessarily been worth preserving.
We don't set out and never have to destroy the old parts of the city. They have gone by the wayside, but there have been factors on economic grounds.
I'm very sorry to see Drury Hill go, but a small alleyway should not inhibit the progress of a large scheme.
And the architects were, well, very confident.
We believe that our professional skill and sensitivity will make the new area just as interesting and attractive as the old.
By the time the protesters' article was written, the women were feeling defeated. Try as they might, they could not stop the developments.
It's a tragedy to see the city carved up for what looks like vested interest. Unfortunately, there is still a bias against my sex. They may take notice of protests from men.
When I first came to Nottingham from the West Country, it was full of history and character, and I prowled with me camera and soaked myself in it. Now it is becoming a cheap imitation of an American town.
2 concessions were made by the planners. Some of the ancient caves were preserved and eventually became the City of Caves attraction. The Severns building, which dates to around 1450, was disassembled and moved to Castle Road. Chapter 5: Twilight of the Shops. The Broadmarsh shopping centre opened in 1975 and quickly became one of Nottingham's least popular buildings. The same year it opened, the council had to pay £18,000 to give it a thorough clean. The stairs and lifts were being used as toilets, and there were a lot of discarded meth bottles lying around. In 1988, there was a £9 million refurbishment, but it remained an unpopular place, Nottingham's uninviting southern bulwark. In 2015, the council announced plans to transform and regenerate Broadmarsh, to create a more welcoming southern entrance to the city. Today, as you walk around Broadmarsh, it's quite bleak and desolate. Most of the shops have closed down, the storefronts boarded up. Some of the places I mentioned in part 1 have closed down. Since going down this research wormhole and spending far too much time thinking about the area's history,
Absolutely too much.
a walk through or past Broadmarsh has become very different to me than it was before, as though
There's been so much Artron energy around good old
Broadmarsh.
the time itself has worn thin.
As I walk, my imagination wanders through time. I see the marshes with its tanners and litsters, and a stench so bad even the plague avoided it. I see the friars who lost their land when England split from the Roman Church. I hear the gentry talking about the latest parties at the assembly rooms and the castle. I hear the Willoughby sisters complaining that their father has allowed Woollerton Hall to fall into disrepair. I see the canal arrive and the marshes be replaced by slums. I think of how many lives were lost or ruined by the indifference of those in power to the suffering of the working poor. I think of the dangers of having people in power who personally benefit from maintaining a housing crisis. I hear bombs fall and see the slums cleared in the aftermath of catastrophe. An air raid siren rings, and I see people running to the caves. I think of the stubborn confidence, and possible corruption, of the city planners who destroyed so much of Nottingham's history to build concrete blocks, despite local resistance. And when looking at the shops, I think of how long it took for shops to become so common, and how strange our consumerist world must be to someone from the past. And I wonder whether people in the future will look back in disbelief on our current obsession with shopping. And then I look to the near future, and I see Broadmarsh transforming and regenerating.
go.
Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed these videos, please consider liking, commenting, sharing and subscribing. Give me them sweet likes! And if you'd like to support me making more videos, you can become a patron on Patreon or make a one-off donation via PayPal. And the links will appear.
Oh, okay. Right. Cool.
Roll credits!